Welcome to Iran, the home of majestic architectural masterpieces like the Sheikh Lutfallah Mosque and the Golestan Palace. Although having its roots in ancient times, the country itself has a very recent history, only becoming an Islamic republic in the year 1979. The land where Iran is located was formerly known as Persia, and once a dominating world power during the times of Cyrus the Great. The official name of the country is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and as I mentioned earlier, it became an Islamic Republic in the year 1979. This was when the monarchy was overthrown and religious clerics assumed the political power under Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini. The official language in Iran is Persian, also known as Farsi. At the time of filming this episode, the population of Iran is estimated to be 80,796,038 people. Iran currently is the world's 18th most populous country, and comprising a land area of 1,648,195 square kilometers, it's the second largest country in the Middle East and the 17th largest country in the world. Iran is located in West Asia, and it borders the Caspian Sea in the north and the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman in the south. Iran is bordered by the countries Afghanistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, and Turkmenistan. Here is the official flag of Iran. This flag was adopted in the year 1980, and it has three equal horizontal bands of green, white, and red. The green is the color of Islam and represents growth. White symbolizes honesty and peace, and the red stands for bravery, as well as it represents all of the martyrs. Now when you take a look in the center white band, there's a stylized version of the word Allah, as well as the phrase La ilaha illa Allah, meaning there's no deity but God. It's more specifically also translated as there is no God but Allah. It's also written in the shape of a tulip, as well as along the inner edges of the green and red stripes, we see the phrase Allahu Akbar written 22 times, and that means God is great. Now, in terms of the marriage culture of Iran, this is pretty interesting. Because traditional Iranian marriages can be so expensive, the government often comes in and provides funding for weddings. This is to help reduce the costs and encourage young Iranians to get married. And just to give you a little bit of history behind that, in the late 1990s, because of the rise of financial costs for weddings, it led Mohammad Khatami, the fifth president of Iran, to establish a program that promoted marriage among university students, as well as promoting a more traditional, old-fashioned, not-so-elegant type of wedding. Initially, the government distributed half-ounce gold coins to couples that were eligible for the funding, but this policy completely backfired after the number of divorces started to skyrocket. Many of the young couples that were being encouraged to get married, in fact, weren't ready for marriage. There's also mass weddings where couples can get married free of charge. This is because many organizations offer funding solutions for lower income Iranian families. Because when it comes to dealing with the expenses of a jahaziye, or in other words, a dowry, things can get really expensive. And just to give you a little bit more insight, a bride's family is expected to provide a substantially high dowry. Oftentimes, this dowry is drawn up in a contractual agreement before the wedding ceremonies. Fathers, of course, want their daughters to have all the good things that money can buy, as well as a home with the latest gadgets and technologies. So, of course, they're going to set the dowry real high. However, many critics have said that this dowry system contributes a lot to people's mental depression, especially among young Iranians that are of marriage age. They say the stress is just too much. But I would love to hear your thoughts. Any Iranians watching this, what are your thoughts on the dowry system? Let me know down below. Again, we're not here to bash anyone's culture. This is FTD Facts. We like to talk about the various aspects of every country and place that we dive into, just so that we can have a better understanding of exactly where people are coming from. Oftentimes we're really quick to say, oh, that is bad, that should never happen. And we don't take time to examine other people's culture and hear exactly where they're coming from and understand their perspective. So yeah, guys, let me know down below your thoughts on this. Now, Iran is one of the few countries in the world where a couple can have a temporary marriage. Yeah, we're touching a little bit more on the marriage culture. I found it very fascinating. A sighe, literally meaning a pleasure marriage, are permitted under Sharia law in certain places. Now, since we are talking about relationships, let's touch real quick on the topic of homosexuality. While homosexual relationships are banned in Iran, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini decreed that transsexuals are allowed to have sex change operations in Iran. Since 2008, Iran has conducted more sex change operations than any other country in the world, second only to Thailand. In fact, the government offers financial help for people that want this type of surgery. Now looking a little bit more into the history of Iran, the region now called Iran used to be occupied by the Medes and the Persians in the 1500s BC. But this was until the Persian king Cyrus the Great actually overthrew the Median Empire, and he became the ruler of the Achaemenid Empire ruled by the Persians. That lasted from 550 BC to 330 BC. The history of the Persian people also have very religious significance. According to the ancient Hebrew scriptures written by the prophet Isaiah of ancient Israel, God actually mentioned Cyrus would conquer other nations. And according to scholars, this was 150 years before the time of Cyrus the Great. According to Isaiah 45 verse 1, it says, "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him that gates may not be closed." You may also know that Iranians are known for their woven rugs. Everybody loves those Persian rugs. But did you know that when creating these rugs, many Iranian weavers make a mistake intentionally? And this is to show their belief that only God is perfect. Interesting to note that after oil, the second largest export commodity that Iran has is rugs. As we keep looking into history, we can continuously see just how advanced the Persian people were. Since ancient times, people used a water supply system called a qanat. What the qanats did was collect underground water and moved them through tunnels to places where people needed water. The qanat technology is known to have been developed in Iran by the Persian people around 1000 BC, and it spread from there. Qanats are basically a series of vertical shafts similar to wells that are connected by sloping tunnels. And these qanats effectively delivered large amounts of water from underground up to the surface without the use of any pump. Now let's touch real quick on Persian cats. Persian cats are one of the world's oldest breeds of cats. They have their history in the high plateaus of Iran, and their long silky fur protected them from cold weather. Italian traders brought the cats to Europe in the 17th century, and that's where they became an exotic status symbol. Now, for one of the most important things in the world right now, oil. The Persian Gulf holds 60% of the whole world's oil reserves. Iran alone has reserves of 125 billion barrels of oil, and that's 10% of the world's total reserves. Iran pumps nearly 4 million barrels of oil a day. Persians have one of the oldest cultures in the world, and as I mentioned in part 1, Persia was once a dominant world power. And because of that, Persia, now Iran, has influenced many cultures and people from Italy and Greece to Russia to South and East Asia, just to name a few. Oftentimes Iran has been confused with the neighboring state of Iraq, and even to this day a lot of Iranians try to separate themselves from being confused with Iraqis and still refer to themselves as Persian, just so that the name isn't ever confused. But that's another thing altogether. Anyways, let's move on. The Greeks in the 5th century BC used the names like Perses, Persiki, or Persis for Cyrus the Great's empire, and those names are understood to mean country. These words were taken from the Persia, which was the name for the people who Cyrus the Great first ruled, and that was before he ruled other Iranian kingdoms. So historically, Iranians themselves never referred to Iran as Persia. The name Persia was just pretty much put on them. In the Latin language, the name for the whole empire was Persia, while Iranians knew it as Iran or other variations of the word Iran. Now let's skip a ton of history, jump into the year 1935. This was when the suggestion for the name change from Persia to Iran was brought up. And it was brought up by a Persian ambassador to Germany who was a Nazi supporter in the year 1935. At that time, Aryanism was considered by the Nazis to be the most superior form of race. The Persian ambassador was then persuaded by the Nazis in thinking that Persia would be better off as an ally of Nazi Germany. From there, he was convinced to call the country by its Persian name, Iran, which was also used in Western languages. Now, the term Persia was the official name for Iran before 1935, but as I mentioned, the Iranian people inside the country, they call their country area, Iran, Iran Zamin, which all meant the land of Iran. Those are some of the derivatives, as well as there were some other ones, but they all pretty much meant the same thing. And that was going on since before 1000 BC, way back. So in 1935, the name change was an attempt to start a new era in Iranian history, and that era was supposed to exalt the Iranian side of its people. So the name Iran, which is also derived from the word area, we see that link to Aryanism right there. You've probably also heard the term Farsi. Farsi is actually the Persian word for Persian, but in the 20th century it began to be used as the name of the Persian language. So to summarize all of that naming-ism that we just did, why do we have the confusion over the names Persian and Iranian? Up until the year 1935, following a naming system that was started by the ancient Greeks, in all of the Western languages, today's Iran was known as Persia, a name that was different from the word used in Persia, which was always Iran or a variation of Iran. So I hope you guys followed closely to that, and I really hope that I did clear up any confusion that you may have had about the Iranian people. But now, since we got all that cleared up, for the second half of this episode, I want to focus on some general facts about Iran, some of which are very fascinating. Iran's capital and largest city, Tehran, has some of the worst air pollution in the whole entire world. It's estimated that 27 people die each and every day from air pollution related diseases. Now, moving on to the Karen River. This river right here is the only river in Iran that can be navigated by boat. And even though it can be navigated by boat, you can only do that for a short distance. Now I'm going to throw in another fun fact here. Approximately 70% of Iran's population is under the age of 30. So we got a lot of young up-and-comers ready to just take Iran by storm and transform the future. It's going to be crazy and amazing to see all the possibilities that they create for the future of Iran. Now, as I mentioned, Tehran is the capital and largest city of Iran, but Tehran was first chosen as the capital of Iran by Agha Muhammad Khan of the Qajar dynasty in 1796. But despite having earthquakes occur during that time period and even before that, some of the buildings from ancient Iran actually still exist today. Okay, now take a look at this, guys. This is Mount Damavand. And you know, this is listed as an active volcano, right? It's also the highest peak in Iran as well as the rest of the Middle East, and it's the highest volcano in all of Asia. It's 5,610 meters, which is 18,410 feet above sea level. And did you know that tea is also the national drink in Iran? Everybody drinks tea. It's like embedded in their culture. It's like trying to separate your skin from your muscles. Iran without tea is like people not watching FTD Facts. Like, how do they live without it? Just saying. By the way, if you're new here, subscribe and hit that bell notification. You don't want to miss our videos. Shameless plug. Iran's the world's 7th major tea producer, as well as Iran has one of the highest per capita rates of tea consumption in the entire world. But moving on to another consumable substance, one a lot more dangerous than tea, alcohol. In Iran, the alcohol industry brings in around $700 million every year. A lot of the alcohol is smuggled in illegally, but people love alcohol. They risk getting lashes and other form of punishment just to get a drink. These alcohol laws were put in place in 1979 when the Shah was overthrown and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini came into power. Now, in terms of religion, Islam is the official religion of Iran, and in terms of the whole total religious population, Muslims total at 99.4%. The other religions of Judaism and Christianity, as well as people that have unspecified religions, fall into the remainder of the percentage. The country of Iran has a very dynamic culture and history, and because of the changes in the cultural practices in the country, Iran is often a very misunderstood country. Starting at number 10, Iranians are Arabs? Okay, so due to its association with Islam, Iran is often mistakenly considered as an Arab state, but it's not an Arab state, guys. This is often assumed because the names Iran and Iraq are very similar. Iraqis are the ones who are Arabs though, and because both of the countries they practice Islam. But no, Iranians are Persian, so completely different ethnic identity from the Arabs. Similar to number 10, Iranians are often believed to speak the Arabic language, but no, they speak Persian, aka Farsi, and Farsi is an Indo-European language that is more closely related to English than the Scandinavian languages. And if you train your ear, you can definitely start picking up Farsi does not even sound close to Arabic at all. Now the next thing is Iranians are defined by Shia Islam. So of course now Iran is a Shia Muslim majority country, but what many people forget is that Iran was not always a Muslim majority country. Iranians actually have 2,500 years of pre-Islamic culture that really continues to strongly influence the country's identity. Persia, as it was known back then, had an ancient and very powerful history, especially with the rise of King Cyrus the Great, who conquered huge portions of land, and then he eventually created a unified Persia. And you can even find some of King Cyrus's activities in both the Bible as well as other related literature. And of course there were some other great successors after King Cyrus. So their culture, yeah, it goes way back before the days of Islam. Another big lie is that the women in Iran wear all black and are covered from head to toe. So although many women definitely cover up in black, this is actually not the norm. So most women wear modest clothing, yes, of course, with a headscarf that's mandatory in the country, as well as they decorate themselves and wear different types of clothing. Even some clothing looks very similar to what people wear in the West and parts of Europe. Iran has one climate, hot, similar to many Middle Eastern countries. What people think of when they think of Iran is just sand, complete hotness. However, did you know that Iran is one of the few countries in the world that has 4 seasons, and depending on the time of the year and even the region, you can experience all extremes of weather. There's a high season from March to May, and this is where you get a mild spring temperature, and then June and July, they're very hot. And then seasons of autumn, you know, going into September through November, it kind of gets a little chilly and a little cold. Iran is not as cheap as you think. Okay, so people traveling to Iran, they have viewed Iran as a haven where you can see and do everything, all on a very tight budget. However, a lot of people start realizing that Iran is not as cheap as you might think. Things cost some money there. While of course there are things that you can get for cheap just like in any other country, you'll see that you start to spend the same amount of money as you would do in parts of Europe. And you can just Google rich kids of Iran and you'll take a look and see that no, Iran has some expensive stuff. Another big misconception is that Iran is a completely underdeveloped country. Now some people are unfamiliar with Iran to that point where they just think that it's just an archaic country stuck in the past. However, it's actually quite advanced, especially in the fields of modern medicine, technology. There are even some modern buildings that you would never believe are in the country of Iran. So to say people in Iran are living backwards and it's still a developing nation, it's a total big lie. Now this one's a little bit controversial. Women cannot drive, they can't vote, can't work. Really? In Iran? Well, you'll be surprised to know that females are very integrated into life in Iran. They also receive a full education. Also, the majority of college students are female, which is pretty interesting because Iran has the highest female to male education enrollment ratio among sovereign nations. And that I did not know. So Iranian women, yeah, very smart and educated people. So is it true that Iranians hate Westerners? Well, yeah, that's a big misconception. especially when you look at the media. This is definitely propagated in TV shows as well. However, this is so far from the truth. Iranians actually love foreigners. Even I have some Iranian friends, and they are some of the most loving people that I know. So although the governments may sometimes be at odds with other governments, Iranians don't actually equate the people of that country to their government. And surprisingly, Iranians are pretty fond of Americans. And the final big lie and misconception about Iran is that Iran is dangerous. Many countries are advising against traveling to Iran, but this is a lot to do because of the diplomatic relationships rather than genuine concern for safety in the country. It's surprising to note that violent crimes against people from different countries are very rare in Iran, and it is a very safe destination for tourists. Of course, there are some areas that are a little bit more prone to crime than others, but you'll find that in any country. But to put that label, that blanket label on the country, it's not a fair assessment of Iran. Persia, now known as Iran, has made some very important contributions to our world that sometimes go unnoticed. Okay, so starting off with the first one, at number 10, we have animation. This one blew my mind. So animation is considered to be a modern technology that has advanced a lot within the last century, but it actually dates back to ancient Persia. A 5,200-year-old goblet was discovered in the burnt city. You can see a series of drawings of a goat jumping and eating leaves from a tree. Sequences of this image were also found in other goblets in medieval Islamic Persia. And this piece of art was discovered by an Italian archaeologist from a burial site in Persia. And next up we have the battery. A battery was discovered that was made out of a ceramic pot and some metal. And the battery is known as the Parthenon battery. The battery was tested by Western scientists, and they noticed that when the battery jar was filled with vinegar or some other type of electrolyte, it generated a current of 1.5 to 2 volts. And this predates the invention of the electric battery by Alessandro Volta of Italy in the 1800s. Next up we have human rights. So this thing right here, the Cyrus Cylinder, it's recognized as the world's first universal charter of human rights. It's been dated back to 534 BCE, and the Cyrus Cylinder is made from clay with Akkadian cuneiform script, and it was discovered in the ancient area of Babylon in 1879, which is in Iraq, and it's now kept in the British Museum in London. Do you know that Persians also invented the postal service? Chapar Kane is the Persian term for the first postal service, and it was used during the Achaemenid Empire. It was created by Cyrus the Great and later developed further by Darius the Great as a method of communication throughout the Persian lands. The system comprised of a series of stations along a 2,500-meter highway throughout the empire, where the Chapars would ride horseback to be delivered from one area to another area in the kingdom. This one's another mind-blowing one. There's also the Yakchal, which is a refrigerator. So the Yakchal is an ancient evaporation cooler. So this thing is pretty awesome. The words Yak means ice and Chal means pit. These refrigerators were mainly built and used in Persia, and the Persians had mastered the technique of building and using the Yakchal by 400 BC. The structure above the ground was dome-shaped and had subterranean storage space. The underground spaces were up to 5,000 cubic meters in volume, and many of these are still standing today. Cold air entered the structure through the base. The cone shape of the Yakchal made the remaining heat flow upwards and out, which caused the inside to remain cooler than the outside temperatures. The ice was created in the winter and it was stored in the Yakchal for the summer. The Persians were just brilliant. Also, algebra has its roots in ancient Persia. Muhammad bin Musa al-Khwarizmi was a Persian scholar who lived from 750 to 850 AD. His work spanned from mathematics, astronomy, geography, and today he's best known for his method through which he taught algebra as an independent science. And this is why he is known as the founding father of algebra. Then there's also sulfuric acid. Abu Bakr Muhammad al-Razi, he was a Persian astronomer astronomer, geographer, and mathematician, and he discovered sulfuric acid, also known as vitriol. It formed the basis for chemical engineering in modern chemistry, and sulfuric acid is used in many things like fertilizers, detergents, and a bunch of other stuff. There's also the use of the alphabet. During the mid-6th century BC, the Persian Empire of the Achaemenid dynasty rose to supremacy, and it spread across Mesopotamia as well as Afghanistan. The Old Persian language developed during the early history of this dynasty, and Old Persian is classified as a syllabic script, and many sounds began to be spelled with a combination of characters rather than having its own unique symbol. Later on, a more recent Persian language known as Pre-Middle Persian was used. The earliest version of the modern guitar exists in the form of the tar or lute. Of course, now the guitar is one of the most popular and widely used musical instruments in the world, and the Persian type of guitar was made using a wooden box and some strings, and it was invented at the time when musical instruments were a very rare thing to own. And the final discovery and invention I want to share with you is the water supply system known as qanat. In the early days of the Persian civilization, a very well designed and managed water supply system existed, and it still exists today. The qanat was an underground channel that was used to carry water from the water well to fields as well as houses, and its origins can be traced back to the first millennia BC, and the tunnels that made up the qanat were several kilometers long and were actually dug by hand. Starting at number 10, we have alcohol. Yeah, a lot of you commented in part 1 saying, hey, you forgot alcohol. I didn't forget alcohol, I just didn't put it in the video because I can only fit 10 in. Anyway, so alcohol no doubt is one of the most used products in the entire world. But did you know that it was first invented by a Persian doctor named Mohammed bin Zakaria al-Razi? He had been working on different gases and chemicals and invented alcohol. As time went on, the form of alcohol was modified and also simplified by other people. In at number 9, there is hookah. So the Persians also invented hookah, and you see this thing right here. Yeah, this device here, it's like there's a pipe that's used for smoking and vaporizing, and there are all sorts of flavors that you can smoke. There are different types of hookah as well with their own unique features. The water is used for vaporizing, the pipes are used for smoking, and the base is used for the flavoring. And this was used for hundreds of years. Hookah was later used and developed in a better form and used in other regions of the world. And do you know the game backgammon? Well, I've never played it before, but it's always fascinated me growing up. Backgammon is a board game that was created in Iran, and it's a 2-player game. Each player has 15 checker pieces that move between 24 points, and movements are based on rolling 2 dice. The objective of the game is to be the first to remove all the 15 checkers off of the board, and backgammon also influenced games like chess. But backgammon isn't the only game in this episode invented by the Persians. We also have polo. This game was first created in Persia in 600 BC, and it was known as chogan. The game was originally used as practice for the army in the Achaemenid Empire, but it really became popular in the Parthian era. From there it turned into a worldwide sport during the Sassanid Empire. In ancient Persia, chogan had 2 types. There was one without the horse so that children could play it, and there's another version with horses for teens, young adults, whatever. And of course, playing it on horseback was just so much more fun. Kerosene lamps coming in at number 6. So a kerosene lamp, also known as a paraffin lamp in some countries, is a type of lamp that uses kerosene as fuel, just like the name implies. Kerosene lamps have a wick or mantle as the light source, covered by glass, and like oil lamps, these come in handy for keeping your place well lit during a power outage. They are often brought on camping trips as well as a backup for battery-powered flashlights. The first description of a simple lamp using crude mineral oil was provided by the Persian alchemist al-Razi in the 9th century Baghdad, who referred to it as the Nafata in his Kitab al-Asrar, known as the Book of Secrets. Okay, grab is at number 4. 5. A grab is a mechanical device with 2 or more jaws, and grabs can be used for things like dredging, loading and unloading ships, and salvaging. The mechanical grab, specifically the clamshell grab, was invented by the Persian Banu Musa brothers and described in their book of ingenious devices in the 9th century. The grab described by the Banu Musa brothers was used to remove objects from underwater and recover things in other bodies of water. The wind tower comes in at number 4. A wind tower, aka a wind catcher, is an Iranian structure used to create natural ventilation in buildings. There are various types of wind catchers. There are the unidirectional ones, the 2-directional ones, as well as the multi-directional ones. They were used in ancient Iranian architecture, and you can still find wind catchers in Iran today, as well as in Persian-inspired architecture in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan. Here we also have the Panamone windmill. So a Panamone windmill is a type of wind turbine, and it has a vertical rotating axis with horizontal wind catching blades. The earliest known windmill device was made by the Persians, and it was in the Panamone design. When the wind blew, the windmill turned, and there would normally be a grain grinder attached to it or some other type of device. Now, the earliest recorded windmill design was found in Persia, and it's believed to have been invented between 700 and 900 AD. Wind-powered machines may have been known earlier, but there's really no clear evidence of windmills prior to that time period. At number 2, we have the Book of Healing and the Canon of Medicine. Abu Ali bin Sina was a Persian physician, astronomer, and a philosopher of the Islamic Golden Age. Now, when he was only 18 years old, he started to record his most important works, including an encyclopedia of medicine, the Book of Healing and the Canon of Medicine. Now, the Canon of Medicine was considered an authority in the medical world for centuries. It set the standards for medicine in medieval Europe and the Islamic world, and was used as a textbook throughout the 18th century in Europe. And it also actually still is used in Unani medicine, which is a form of medicine practice over in India. And finally, at number 1, we have Zoroastrianism. This here is considered by many to be the world's oldest monotheistic religion, and it was founded by the prophet Zarathustra over 3,500 years ago in the city of Yazd, which is now in Iran. It's estimated that there are about 200,000 Zoroastrians today, and Zoroastrians worship a god called Ahura Mazda and believe that fire is an element that represents the light and wisdom of this god. Zoroastrianism also influenced the Abrahamic religions, and it was the official religion of several areas of Persia until the 7th century AD, after which Islam became the dominant religion.